Tanya Harris stepped into the crowded courtroom, her heels clicking sharply on the cold marble floor. The noise echoed through the high ceilings like a silent warning. She paused at the entrance, scanning the sea of faces in front of her, a dozen people, all looking in different directions, some with their heads down, others nervously checking the time. Tanya straightened her back, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the judge seated high above the others on the bench, his stern expression framed by the dark wood behind him. The room fell silent as her presence became noticed. She was the last person called for the morning docket. She walked forward without hesitation, her demeanor calm yet undeniably strong. She didn't show any outward sign of nervousness, despite the fact that she was about to face a man who had already made up his mind about her before she even spoken. The judge, a middle-aged white man with thinning hair and a pair of glasses perched on the edge of his nose, glanced over his paperwork briefly before addressing her, his voice deep and authoritative. "Tanya Harris," he said, his tone casual yet carrying an undercurrent of judgment. "What brings you here today?" Tanya's throat tightened, but she forced herself to maintain her composure, standing tall. As she responded, "I was cited for speeding in a residential area, Your Honor," she said. "I didn't realize the speed limit had dropped so low until it was too late. I was trying to get to a meeting. I'm sorry for the oversight, but I didn't intend to break the law." Judge Walker didn't seem impressed. He looked at her with a disinterested glance, and then back at the paperwork before him. He didn't even look up as he began to speak. "So you admit to breaking the law?" Then Tanya, her hands clenched at her sides. But she stayed calm. "Yes, Your Honor, I admitted to speeding, but I didn't realize the full extent of my mistake until after the fact. I've always driven carefully and never had an issue before," she explained, hoping her words might make a difference. His eyes flickered briefly over her simple attire, the plain blouse and dark skirt she wore for the hearing, which contrasted sharply with the expensive suit he expected of someone who might make such a claim. There was a slight tilt to his head, as if considering something. For a moment, he cleared his throat and then spoke again in a dismissive tone. "Well, Ms. Harris, it seems we've heard your excuse, but the law is clear, and it's people like you who are causing issues in our neighborhoods and endangering others," he said without emotion. "People like me." Tanya repeated the words in her mind before speaking up. "No, Your Honor, I just made a mistake, a human mistake. But I'm not someone who causes problems, not in the way you're suggesting." Judge Walker wasn't listening anymore. He had already made up his mind. His voice raised slightly as he continued his sentence. "You're lucky. This is just a fine and not a more serious charge. I'll be issuing a penalty of $250 for your violation, and I suggest you take this as a lesson for future behavior." His words felt like a slap in the face to Tanya as she stood there, but she said nothing, just nodded and accepted the ruling, her mind whirling with frustration. She was judged for something she knew wasn't an attempt to break the law. She wasn't a careless driver. She was someone who worked hard and constantly had to prove herself. But here in this courtroom, she was just another person to be dismissed with an assumption. She wasn't sure she could change his judgment now, but the sting of it lingered with her long after the gavel came down. Judge Walker leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled together as he stared at the papers in front of him. The morning's cases had left him with a feeling of self-assurance that came with years of experience. He glanced over his notes on Tanya Harris's case once more, muttering under his breath, the name rolling off his tongue as if it were just another number in the pile. He could hardly believe how quickly the case had been resolved. Nothing unusual about it, just another speeding ticket from a woman who clearly hadn't been paying attention. His secretary knocked on the door, entering with a stack of new case files. She placed them on his desk and then lingered, watching as the judge thumbed through a few of them absently, still distracted by his thoughts about the morning. He had assumed from the moment Tanya had stepped into his courtroom that she was just another minor offender, someone who didn't have the education or the means to challenge the authority of the court. She'd been too calm, too composed in a way that suggested she didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. And when she tried to explain herself, it had come across as weak, almost rehearsed. He wasn't buying it. It was the same story he heard time and time again. People who thought they could talk their way out of trouble, who didn't take responsibility for their actions. He muttered to himself, shaking his head. People like Tanya, like so many others, often used their calm demeanor to mask their lack of real responsibility. They thought they were above the law, too proud to admit when they made a mistake. Judge Walker had seen it before, people who tried to appeal to his sense of leniency, hoping that he would see their innocence where there was none. The law was clear, and it was always his job to uphold it without allowing personal feelings to cloud his judgment. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, his thoughts began to wander. He had heard the same type of defense in cases for years, and he had grown used to brushing off any pretensions that came his way. He wasn't a fool. He had seen enough to know when someone was trying to manipulate the system. In his mind, Tanya was no different. She was just another person who had decided to test the system, to play the game of pleading ignorance. What she didn't understand, or perhaps didn't care to admit, was that the law didn't bend for people who accidentally broke the rules. And yet he found himself troubled by a small feeling he couldn't quite shake, a nagging suspicion that maybe he hadn't given her a fair chance. The following day, while Judge Walker went about his routine, something continued to tug at the back of his mind. He couldn't help but replay Tanya's face in his memory, her calm, controlled demeanor, her refusal to flinch under the weight of his disapproval. It seemed out of place for someone who was supposed to be just a simple driver, someone who didn't know the system. It was as if there was something more beneath her exterior, a subtle confidence that hinted at a deeper understanding of how things worked. But he quickly dismissed the thought. No, she was just like all the others. Another case to move past, another moment to forget. He had a courtroom to run, and his job wasn't to entertain doubts. He continued his day, unaware that the name Tanya Harris would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Tanya stepped out of the courthouse, her mind still buzzing with the sting of the morning's encounter. The bitter taste of the fine hung heavy in her chest, but she knew better than to let it show. The world outside was indifferent, bustling with the lives of people who rarely saw what lay beneath the surface. In her mind, the courtroom was just another battleground, a place where assumptions were made and judgments were handed down like simple verdicts. She had fought battles before, bigger ones, and she had learned long ago how to fight with grace. But today was different. Today, she had been judged before she even had a chance to speak. Her thoughts didn't linger long on the judge, though. She had learned that focusing on the prejudices of others was a waste of energy. As her heels clicked along the sidewalk, Tanya quickly shifted her focus to the day ahead. She had no time to wallow in anger, not when the clock was ticking and her clients depended on her. She had bigger things to do. After a brief drive across town, Tanya entered the sleek glass and steel building that housed her law firm. The cold, clinical atmosphere of the building greeted her like an old friend. Nothing personal, just business. She waved at the receptionist, exchanged pleasantries with a few colleagues, and moved swiftly toward her office. As she entered, the door closed behind her with a soft click, and she exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The room was exactly as she left it, immaculate, organized, designed for efficiency. It was her sanctuary, the one place where she was in complete control. Her assistant, Jenna had already set up her schedule for the day. Tanya's calendar was packed with back-to-back meetings, conference calls, and case preparations. She had little time for distractions. Her team depended on her sharp mind and her ability to stay focused under pressure, and that's exactly what she planned to do. But as she removed her coat and settled into her chair, her mind couldn't fully shake the memory of Judge Walker's courtroom. His dismissive tone, the way he had sized her up, his assumption that she was just another ordinary woman who didn't know her place, it all sat uncomfortably inside her. He had underestimated her, and she couldn't let that go. Tanya wasn't just any woman. She was one of the top corporate lawyers in the city, known for negotiating multi-million-dollar deals and handling complex mergers. Her clients included some of the biggest names in business, from tech giants to financial moguls. She had built her career from the ground up, never once relying on anyone's favor or anyone's assumptions about her abilities. Her success was not a fluke. It was the result of years of sacrifice, late nights, and unrelenting determination. She had fought to get where she was, and she had fought to stay there. She had earned her place in a world that was often unwilling to accept women like her, especially women of color. But in the courtroom that morning, Tanya had felt like she had been stripped of all of that. The judge's assumptions had been harsh, cruel even, but they weren't unfamiliar. She had faced them before, many times, in fact. There was a familiar sting to it, like a wound that never quite healed. But what troubled her the most was the realization that people like Judge Walker never saw her as she truly was. To him, she was just another black woman, someone who could easily be written off. He had no idea who she was, what she had achieved, or the power she wielded. And that, in itself, was the most frustrating part. The world was full of people like him, people who only saw the surface and made judgments based on nothing more than their own biases. Tanya had no illusions. She knew that in many circles her success would always be measured against a different standard than that of her white male counterparts. But today, she realized something else. She didn't need their recognition. Her power wasn't something that could be given or taken away. It was something she had built, brick by brick, on her own terms. With a deep breath, Tanya opened the first case file of the day, ready to dive into the work that mattered. But she knew, in the back of her mind, that the encounter with Judge Walker was far from over. She would rise from this, just as she had risen from everything else. There was more to her story than he could ever understand, and she was about to make sure he knew it. This part continues Tanya's internal monologue, revealing her strength, her drive, and how she handles prejudice with grace while continuing to push forward. The following morning, Judge Walker sat in his chambers, the quiet hum of the clock on the wall the only sound breaking the silence. He was sorting through case files, his mind still lingering on Tanya Harris. The nagging feeling from yesterday hadn't left him. It was a minor thing, he told himself, just a speeding ticket, nothing to lose sleep over. But something about her had unsettled him in a way it was hard to ignore. Her calmness, the way she handled his judgment with an almost eerie composure. It was as if she had seen it all before, as if she had encountered this type of treatment 1,000 times and had learned to rise above it. For a moment, Judge Walker couldn't shake the suspicion that he might have misjudged her, that there was more to Tanya Harris than he had realized. He reached over to the stack of papers on his desk, pulling out a few more files. His secretary knocked softly before entering, holding a letter in her hands. "Judge, there's a notice from the Bar Association for you," she said, her voice polite but matter of fact. "Thanks, Margie," Judge Walker replied, taking the envelope and setting it on his desk. The letter had a clean, official look to it, marked with the emblem of the city's Bar Association. His curiosity piqued. He opened the letter and began to skim through it. It was a routine notification about upcoming seminars and new law updates. But then something caught his eye. A name. Tanya Harris. The Bar Association had listed her as a member, and not just any member. She was noted as an corporate lawyer and a highly regarded one of that. Judge Walker froze, the words staring up at him in disbelief. His mind raced back to the previous day's hearing. Tanya Harris wasn't just a simple woman caught in a moment of speeding. She wasn't some everyday driver he could brush aside. The woman he had dismissed so easily was a highly skilled, respected lawyer, a person whose career was built on expertise, negotiation, and a deep understanding of the law. She was someone who had likely seen courtrooms like his countless times, someone who had mastered the art of law with a precision he could not have imagined. His heart began to pound, the weight of his earlier assumptions bearing down on him. How had he missed it? He quickly pulled up her name on his computer, trying to confirm what he had just read. The more he read, the more his embarrassment grew. Tanya Harris wasn't just a corporate lawyer. She was a partner in one of the city's most prestigious firms, known for handling multi-million-dollar mergers and high-profile litigation. Her reputation in the legal community was impeccable. How had he, of all people, failed to recognize that? Judge Walker's mind churned with guilt, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of doubt. How many times had he dismissed others based on surface-level judgments? How many times had he assumed that people like Tanya, people of color, were less capable simply because they didn't fit his image of success. He had always prided himself on being impartial, on judging based solely on the facts of the case. But now he realized that he had let his biases seep into his judgment, clouding his ability to see the truth. As he sat there, the reality of his mistake hit him like a wave. He had treated Tanya as though she were just another ordinary person, someone who didn't deserve the respect that he readily gave to others in the courtroom. But now, in the quiet of his office, he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just his mistake, it was a systemic problem, one that many others had faced and still faced every day. Tanya's case had revealed something deeper within him, something he had never fully acknowledged: his own biases. Judge Walker closed his computer and leaned back in his chair, taking a long, steadying breath. He knew what he had to do. He needed to apologize to Tanya, to himself, and to the larger system that had allowed such biases to thrive. But the question lingered in his mind, which he even accepted. It had been 2 days since Judge Walker had discovered the truth about Tanya Harris, and every passing hour seemed to intensify the discomfort that sat in his chest. The more he thought about their interaction, the more his conscience gnawed at him. He had made assumptions, wrong ones, and it was a mistake he couldn't undo. What bothered him the most wasn't the fact that he had been wrong about Tanya's background. It was that, in doing so, he had undermined everything he stood for as a judge. His impartiality had been compromised, and that, more than anything, had shaken him to his core. He had tried to dismiss it, to move on, but the weight of the guilt was too much. The thought of Tanya, standing there in his courtroom, her poise and grace hiding the deeper layers of her life, haunted him. He had judged her based on her appearance, her tone, her race, on everything but her character, her intellect, and the work she had put into getting where she was. That wasn't how justice was supposed to work. After hours of contemplation, Judge Walker made a decision. He needed to apologize. It was the only way forward. He wasn't sure how she would react, but he couldn't leave things as they were. He dialed his secretary's number, his fingers tense on the phone. "Margie, can you get me the contact information for Tanya Harris? I need to reach her urgently." Moments later, Margie sent over the information, and Judge Walker stood from his desk. His mind raced as he composed the words he needed to say. He had never been good at admitting his mistakes, but this felt different. This wasn't just about his own pride. It was about justice, fairness, and the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward. He picked up the phone and dialed Tanya's number. The ringing felt endless, each second that passed deepening his anxiety. Finally, the line clicked, and her voice greeted him. "Hello, this is Tanya Harris." "Miss Harris," Judge Walker began, his voice steady but filled with a sincerity he had not expected. "This is Judge Walker. I am calling to speak with you about the case that took place in my courtroom 2 days ago." There was a brief silence on the other end, and he could almost hear her curiosity. "Yes, Your Honor," she responded, her tone cautious but not defensive. "I've been thinking a great deal about our interaction," he continued, his words flowing now, as if he could no longer hold back. "And I've come to the painful realization that I misjudged you, both as a person and as a professional. I didn't fully understand who you were when you stepped into my courtroom, and I treated you in a way that I deeply regret. I assumed things about you based on your appearance, your demeanor, and, frankly, your race. And that was wrong." Tanya's response was quiet, almost too quiet. He couldn't tell if she was surprised, angry, or even relieved. But he pressed on, unable to stop the words now. "I'm not calling to make excuses," he added. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I failed you as a judge, and I failed in upholding the ideals of fairness and justice that I'm supposed to represent. You didn't deserve that." There was another silence, and for a moment, Judge Walker thought he might have made a mistake in calling her at all. He had no way of knowing how Tanya would respond, but he knew this was something he had to do. Finally, Tanya spoke. "Judge Walker," she said, her voice calm but with an unmistakable edge, "I appreciate your apology, but let's be clear. I don't need your pity or your sympathy. I've worked too hard to be where I am, and the opinions of someone like you don't change that. But what I do expect is accountability, not just for me, but for everyone else who has been unjustly dismissed in the way I was. It's not about you and me. It's about the bigger picture. Her words hit him hard. It wasn't anger that spoke through Tanya, but a quiet strength, a clarity of purpose that was far beyond what he had expected. The realization of his own privilege and bias hit him all over again, harder this time. Tanya wasn't looking for validation from him. She didn't need his apology to feel whole. She wanted change, and she had the courage to call it out when it wasn't happening. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet, "and I will do what I can to make sure this doesn't happen again. You've given me something to think about, Ms. Harris, more than you know." Tanya didn't say much more after that, and the conversation ended on a note of mutual understanding, if not resolution. Judge Walker sat in his office, staring at the phone, his thoughts swirling. He knew that this was only the beginning. Tanya had made her point clear, and now it was up to him to ensure that her truth, and the truth of so many others, was never again overlooked. In the days that followed Judge Walker's phone call, Tanya found herself contemplating the exchange more than she had expected. On the surface, it seemed like a simple apology, one that could easily be dismissed as just another gesture made to ease a guilty conscience. But there was something about the sincerity in his voice, the way he had taken full responsibility for his actions, that made Tanya pause. It wasn't common to hear such humility from someone in his position, especially from a judge who wielded so much power over the lives of those who appeared before him. She had heard apologies before, especially in her career. People often apologized when they were caught, when it was in their best interest, or when they felt cornered. But this had felt different. Tanya didn't trust easily, not in the courtroom, not outside of it. But for the first time in a long while, she considered that perhaps this apology was genuine. She had no illusions about the nature of systemic injustice. The courtroom was just one of many places where people like her, black people, women, were often judged by their appearance, their race, or their background rather than their merit. She knew that much all too well. But maybe, just maybe, Judge Walker had begun to understand that as well. Tanya was a woman of action, though. She didn't wait around for change to come to her. If she were going to allow this to be a turning point, she would make it count. She knew that this moment could have a ripple effect, not just in her own life, but in the larger system. The legal system, after all, was meant to be impartial. It was meant to be blind to race, gender, and class. But Tanya knew better. She had seen the disparities firsthand, both as a lawyer and as a person. And if she could use this moment to shed light on those inequities, she would. She reached out to some of her colleagues, both within her firm and in the broader legal community, and began to share her story. Not just the story of the speeding ticket and the unfair treatment in Judge Walker's courtroom, but the larger story of how systemic bias affected the legal profession at every level. It wasn't easy. Some people, like her fellow lawyers, dismissed it as an isolated incident, a simple misunderstanding. But others, more attuned to the challenges faced by marginalized people in the profession, recognized the larger implications. They saw an opportunity for change, for making the legal system more accountable to those who were often ignored. Tanya began working with a group of activists, lawyers, and scholars to develop a series of talks and seminars aimed at educating the public and legal professionals alike about bias in the courtroom. She even arranged for Judge Walker to be part of one of the panels. He had accepted her invitation, albeit reluctantly, but Tanya knew this would be the real test of his commitment to change. It wasn't enough to say sorry. It wasn't enough to make a phone call. True accountability meant taking the steps necessary to ensure that others weren't subjected to the same injustices she had faced. As the days passed, Tanya's efforts gained momentum. The seminars, which covered everything from racial bias in jury selection to the subtle prejudices in sentencing, began to draw attention. The Bar Association took notice, as did local media outlets. Tanya's story, once one of personal frustration, was now becoming a powerful catalyst for reform. Judge Walker, despite his initial discomfort, found himself increasingly invested in the work. He spoke candidly at the seminars about his own mistakes and what he had learned from Tanya. His words, though hard to hear at first, began to resonate with other judges, lawyers, and legal professionals who recognized that if someone in his position could acknowledge his biases and take steps to correct them, then maybe they could too. In the midst of all the attention, Tanya remained focused on her clients and her work. She was a corporate lawyer after all, and her reputation in the business world remained her top priority. But she knew that this moment was bigger than any case she could win. It was about creating real change, change that would outlast her and Judge Walker, change that could ripple through the legal system and beyond. She knew that reform wouldn't come easily, but she also knew that sometimes one small act of accountability could spark something far greater. Tanya Harris wasn't just a lawyer. She was a force, and her fight was far from over. Months passed, and Tanya's campaign for systemic change in the legal profession continued to gain traction. What had started as an individual apology from Judge Walker had blossomed into a full-fledged initiative, one that was challenging the very foundation of bias within the courtroom. Tanya had become a prominent voice in the movement, speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, and using her platform to amplify stories of those who had been wronged or overlooked by the justice system. But this was just the beginning. She had bigger plans in mind. Despite her growing influence, Tanya still faced resistance. Some critics claimed that her efforts were divisive, that focusing on race and bias in the courtroom would only serve to create more tension rather than foster real change. But Tanya wasn't fazed by the opposition. She had been fighting her entire career to be seen and heard in a system that was never designed to accommodate people like her. She understood that real change was never easy and that resistance was a natural part of any movement. Judge Walker, meanwhile, found himself in a position he had never expected. Since his public apology and involvement in the seminars, his relationship with his peers had changed. Some of his colleagues were impressed by his willingness to admit his mistakes and engage in difficult conversations about race and bias. Others, however, viewed him with suspicion. There were whispers in the courthouse, subtle glances exchanged in the hallways, and off-the-record conversations questioning his integrity. Some questioned whether his newfound commitment to reform was truly genuine or just a way to salvage his reputation. But Judge Walker didn't back down. He continued to speak publicly about his own flaws and how he had learned from his interactions with Tanya. He worked closely with Tanya and others in the legal community to push for meaningful reforms in the way judges were trained to recognize and address their biases. He spoke at conferences alongside Tanya, sharing his experiences and urging other judges to join the cause. One afternoon, Tanya and Judge Walker found themselves sitting together in the back of a crowded conference hall at the annual National Legal Conference. It was a pivotal moment in their journey. They had just finished a panel on bias in the courtroom, and the conversation had been electric. The room was filled with lawyers, judges, and activists, all united in the shared goal of making the legal system more just and equitable. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Judge Walker asked Tanya as they sat in a quiet corner, catching their breath after the panel. His voice was tired, but there was a new warmth to it, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Tanya glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had come to hear them speak. There was energy in the air, a palpable sense of hope that hadn't existed when they first started, but she knew better than to get comfortable. Change was never linear, and there were still many battles left to fight. "I think we're getting there," she said, her voice steady. "But it's a long road. We've made some strides, but the real work is in the small, everyday moments. It's in the judges who look at their biases and admit them. It's in the lawyers who recognize their privilege and use it to lift others up. It's in the people who are willing to listen and change their perspectives." Judge Walker nodded, taking in her words. He had come a long way since that first interaction with Tanya. His role in her journey, in the broader movement, had evolved into something he hadn't anticipated. He had gone from the judge who made assumptions to the judge who was actively seeking to dismantle those very assumptions. It had been a humbling process, one that had forced him to confront his own discomfort and acknowledge his part in perpetuating the system of bias he had once been blind to. For Tanya, this was just another step in a much larger mission. She knew that the system couldn't change overnight, but in that moment, as she sat next to Judge Walker, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. Together, they were pushing for a future where the courtroom would be a place where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, could stand and be seen for who they truly were, not defined by the assumptions of those in power, but by their own actions and character. The work wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Tanya felt as though the tide was shifting, and she was ready for whatever came next. It was early spring when Tanya Harris received the invitation she hadn't expected. The National Bar Association, recognizing her tireless work advocating for justice and reform in the legal system, had asked her to speak at their annual conference. It was an incredible honor, one that placed her in a position she had once only dreamed of. But it also came with a weight that had grown heavier as her campaign expanded, as more people began to listen, and as the ripple effect of her actions continued to spread. She had become something of a symbol for reform, not only in her own city but nationwide. Her work with Judge Walker had attracted significant attention, sparking a dialogue about bias and race in the courtroom that had never been as open or as honest before. Tanya was no longer just a corporate lawyer. She was an advocate for a system that desperately needed change. Yet, as she prepared for the conference, she found herself torn between her professional career and the larger fight she had taken on. The latter had become a full-time job, and it was a role she had never envisioned herself filling. The night before her speech, Tanya sat at her desk reviewing her notes. Her thoughts drifted back to the very beginning, when she had first stood in Judge Walker's courtroom, dismissed and underestimated. At that moment, she had felt small, invisible, but she had used that feeling to fuel her. Over the months, she had found strength in that vulnerability, and it had propelled her forward. Yet, as she reviewed the speech, she found that the message she wanted to share had evolved. It was no longer just about her own story. It was about all the people who had been silenced, those who had never had the chance to be heard in a room that was supposed to serve them. She thought about Judge Walker, too. They had both changed since their first interaction. The man who had once underestimated her was now one of the most vocal proponents of reform. He had gone from a judge blind to his own biases to someone who sought to challenge them every day. Tanya couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for both of them, whether their shared work would leave a mark on the system that outlasted their careers. When the day of the conference arrived, Tanya stood at the podium before a packed room of lawyers, judges, activists, and scholars. The room buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another panel discussion. It was a call to action, a critical moment for those in power to reflect on their own biases and begin the long, difficult journey toward meaningful change. Tanya's voice, strong and unwavering, filled the room. "It's not enough to apologize," she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Apologies are the easy part. What matters is what we do after the apology. How do we act when no one is watching? When it's just us in the courtroom with our prejudices, our assumptions, and our biases? How do we ensure that we are serving the people who come before us, not based on how they look or where they come from, but based on who they are?" The room was silent, every ear tuned to her words. Tanya continued, her message now focused on the importance of accountability, not just for individuals, but for the entire legal system. She spoke about her experiences, about Judge Walker's transformation, and about the need for lawyers and judges to confront their own biases, to acknowledge their privileges, and to fight for true equality in the legal system. And as she finished her speech, the applause was not just polite, it was powerful. It was a standing ovation that reverberated through the room, a collective acknowledgement of the work that lay ahead. Tanya felt a lump form in her throat as she stepped down from the podium, but her heart swelled with something stronger: hope. Back in the audience, Judge Walker watched with pride. He had stood by Tanya's side in this journey, and today he knew they had made a difference. But he also understood that this was just one moment in a much larger story. The road ahead would not be easy, and the fight for justice would continue long after they left the stage. But he had learned, in no uncertain terms, that real change required constant effort. It required humility, awareness, and the courage to make uncomfortable decisions. As the conference continued, Tanya found herself surrounded by colleagues, friends, and strangers, people who had been moved by her message and were eager to join the fight. She realized that her work had sparked something larger than herself. It wasn't just about changing the courts, it was about changing the hearts and minds of those who have the power to shape the future of justice. In the end, Tanya's legacy wasn't defined by a single case or a single speech. It was defined by the movement she had helped to spark, one that was continuing to grow, fueled by the voices of those who had long been silenced. It was a movement that wouldn't stop until justice was truly blind, until every person who walked into a courtroom could do so with the knowledge that they would be judged not by their race, their gender, or their background, but by their merit, their truth, and their humanity.